In the Hollywood home of Movieland's Mickey Mouse, artist Walt Disney orders his famous cartoon characters into battle dress. They're in popular demand as emblems for the armed forces. Here's how an Air Corps insignia is created.
When you think of Walt Disney Pictures, you probably don't associate them with creating media for the US government.
This assignment is for the Marines Amphibious Force, a very tough commando tortoise ready for the warpath. And he comes to life before your very eyes.
However, during World War II, the Disney studios were taken over by the US Army almost immediately after the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
A Lockheed Hudson bomber, ready for delivery, is decorated with ferocious Pluto. The inscription tells the story. He's itching for a fight.
The studio was located in close proximity to a Lockheed manufacturing plant, converting the lot into an anti-aircraft base in fear that the Japanese would press into California. The Army would occupy the studio for a period of 8 months, but in the meantime, Walt and his studio were commissioned by the government to produce a variety of films that were both entertaining and educational, but ultimately war propaganda. In many ways, this saved the company from what was a period of financial trouble, and a slate of films from the main Disney animated canon were created during the war. These films are often obscure, even among most Disney fans, yet you would be surprised to find their presence in the parks today. It's possible that no matter how familiar you are with the company, there's a chance you've encountered something in the parks that you didn't know was associated with the war-era films. Today I would like to provide a bit more context and history of said films, exploring this lesser-known topic and highlighting where you can still find elements and even full attractions concerning this long-forgotten era in the parks themselves. Before we really begin, if you like videos like these, just do me a favor and quickly hit the like button. It goes a long way in allowing a video to gain traction. I also recommend subscribing as well if you want to be notified when new videos are released. Disney's library of animated mainline films are often categorized into different eras. The often titled Golden Age of Disney films starts in 1937 with the release of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. While a bit primitive by today's standards, it was for its time an artistic masterpiece, evolving animation beyond just silly shorts that would play before most films, and into an actual, legitimate medium that could be taken seriously in a full-length form. Not only was this incredibly laborious, but it absolutely blew away audiences who had never seen something like this before, with animators studying the movements of real actors and trying to emulate them as realistically as possible. Snow White would achieve both critical and financial success, and Disney's next film would be Pinocchio in 1940. While again a critical success, the film would flop financially. One of the largest reasons attributed to this was the outbreak of World War II, cutting off the release of the film in Europe and Asia. Still, the box office was rather weak regardless. In the same year, Fantasia would release and was presented in a limited form through 13 roadshows. This was done because Disney wanted the film to evolve into a sensory experience that most theaters were not equipped to handle with their current sound systems. A new stereophonic surround sound system was invented as Fantasound, intended to create a truly immersive musical experience when watching the film. However, distributing the film through Disney's choice of RKO was a nightmare. They thought that the film was too long, and it was eventually cut down significantly and presented with a mono soundtrack for the 1942 and 43 theatrical run, selling tickets at a lower price. While this did help achieve a better box office performance, the film still performed at an even greater loss than Pinocchio. Part of the issue with this was the price of animating the films. With the financial success of Snow White, Walt would use the profits to build his studio in Burbank, incurring operational costs as well as hiring an army of people to produce films faster, but also more expensively. While it is true that these first 3 films in the Disney canon are certainly works of art, they were financially risky as well. The next film would be Dumbo, premiering in October of 1941, just a few months before the Japanese would bomb Pearl Harbor. While certainly a classic today, and the animation is iconic, the film took a dip in quality that was meant to save cost and time. Produced for half the price of Snow White, Dumbo was a financial success. The final film of the Golden Age is Bambi, released in 1942. While this did release during the US involvement in World War II, it's not considered a war-era film, as most of its development happened prior to Pearl Harbor. As with other films in this era, it was expensive to animate and ultimately lost money on its first run, despite often being perceived as one of the greatest animated films today. I think that's the story with this age of films, though. Despite being iconic so many decades later, these films didn't lead to the financial success that the studio needed to become stable, even if that seems inconceivable today. By the time Bambi was released, the US Army had already occupied the studio, which seems pretty bad for business, and in many ways it was, as we'll see with the quality of the films in this new era. However, in producing shorts and other media for the US government, the studio at the very least now had a steady stream of income that would keep them afloat in Hollywood through the war, especially with the European film market cut off from their releases. Ironically, Disney was being paid more to produce shorts for the government than they would have made just from theaters. These films, while often overlooked, had quite the impact on the culture of the United States as well as the military. Many of these were full of surprisingly detailed information, with one of the standouts being Victory Through Air Power. Based on the 1942 book of the same name, published by the aviator Alexander de Seversky, the film was meant to capture the attention of US officials and argued in favor of utilizing long-range bombers. Walt believed so heavily in this idea that he actually financed the film himself, and while the US had already engaged in long-range bombing prior, it did have a cultural impact both among the citizens and the government in continuing to utilize the strategy. Still, among the many shorts and films produced by the studio, a handful of feature-length films in the mainline Disney canon would be produced and eventually incorporated into the Disney parks in surprising ways. Let us then transition to that next. Throughout his time as president, Franklin D. Roosevelt adopted what is known as the Good Neighbor policy. Prior to him taking office, the United States would often intervene in the affairs of various countries in Central and South America, most notably during the Wilson administration. In an effort to regain their trust, Roosevelt's policy vowed to keep US troops out, attempting to foster a relationship of respect and encourage trade. As part of this, and because many of these countries had a positive relationship with Germany at the time, the US State Department commissioned a tour of South America in 1941 for Disney to produce a film highlighting various cultural aspects of these countries. This was prior to Pearl Harbor, but as tensions rose and with Disney animation being popular in South America, the studio was seen as the perfect fit. This first film of the war era was titled Saludos Amigos, and would release in 1942 in Brazil, and would later have a 1943 release throughout the US. The war-era Disney films are often known as the package films, in that they always lacked a central narrative, and instead were made up of shorter stories packaged together. Saludos Amigos would be made up of 4 different segments, with the first focusing on the people and culture around Lake Titicaca in Peru. This would then later transition to an animated portion where Donald is seen getting into a series of antics, also attempting to be educational but ultimately entertaining. The next segment would focus on Pedro, a small cartoon airplane flying a perilous mail route from Chile and over the Andes to Argentina. The third segment focuses on the gaucho, nomadic cowhands and horsemen of South America, who are this time featured in Argentina. This segment starts off in an educational manner, focusing on the culture and history of these people, later transitioning to Disney's animators and how they wanted to capture their colorful nature through drawing. This then transitions to an animated portion featuring Goofy as a Texas cowboy. He is then plopped down into Argentina, where through a series of gags, the film attempts to educate the audience on gaucho culture, often comparing the people to Western American cowboys. Finally, the film travels to Brazil, once again using shots of the people to illuminate their culture and to educate. Like the others, this segment eventually transitions to animation, with a portion known as Aquarela do Brasil, or Watercolor of Brazil. It starts rather abstract, but eventually introduces Donald and a new Brazilian parrot, Jose Carioca, who in turn brings Donald to Rio, where they tour the city while dancing to a samba piece. Saludos Amigos would then be followed by a similar film, The Three Caballeros, in 1945, which was also comprised of a series of segments highlighting Central and South American countries, but was far more animation heavy. The film introduces the premise that Donald is celebrating his 10th birthday, and so opens a present to find a film projector and a reel. This reel then presents the birds of the South, first focusing on the story of an Antarctic penguin named Pablo, who travels north in search of warmer weather, eventually reaching the Galapagos Islands. The next part of the reel is a story about a little boy from Argentina who makes friends with a winged donkey named Burrito. The boy then covers up his wings and they attempt to cheat in a race, winning but eventually being exposed as Burrito attempts to fly. The reel then ends and Donald opens a new present, discovering a book from his friend Jose. Here, the book highlights the geography, people, and culture of the Brazilian state of Bahia. Eventually, a live-action portion premieres, where Donald falls for a singer performing a samba. Returning from out of the book, Donald opens his last present, where he then meets the Mexican rooster, Panchito Pistoles. The three celebrate being together through a musical segment, and Donald is eventually gifted a piñata, where he learns its cultural significance. The last few segments of the film focus on Mexico, its people, and culture, also throwing in some live-action musical pieces. These two films haven't been without their controversy, as they have been accused of perpetuating cultural stereotypes. Still, I think the overall aim of being educational is commendable, even if produced as propaganda, and are very much a product of their time. The first in-park representation of these characters, at least as far as I can determine, is the Mickey Mouse Revue, which opens with the Magic Kingdom in 1971. Located where Mickey's PhilharMagic is today, this was an ambitious animatronic show that had characters play and sing through iconic Disney songs from feature animation. One segment would feature the Three Caballeros singing the theme from the film. The Mickey Mouse Revue would eventually be closed in 1980. It was moved to Tokyo Disneyland as an opening day attraction in 1983. Finally, it would close there in 2009, but that wasn't the end of their story. In 2007, Disney would close El Rio del Tiempo in the Mexico Pavilion at Epcot, opening it back up 4 months later as the Grand Fiesta Tour. It was essentially just the same attraction, but replaced its screen-based portions with the antics of the Three Caballeros, removing the educational value that the attraction once had. That's not to say that the films featuring the characters were too overtly educational either, but here it's just annoying, meant to address complaints of children finding the attraction boring. Eventually, in 2015, the animatronics from the Mickey Mouse Revue would be upgraded and installed at the ride's finale, which, while not really fixing anything, is at least worth seeing for its historic value. Because of the Grand Fiesta Tour though, these characters have certainly gained a larger following, and Jose was already pretty popular among Brazilians. Still, we're about to explore films in the Disney canon that are even more obscure, unknown by even the most dedicated of Disney fans. Did you know that there is a spiritual successor to Fantasia? If I asked this question to people familiar with the Disney library, they would probably answer that this film is Fantasia 2000. But no. Following the Three Caballeros, Make Mine Music would premiere in 1946, working in the same spirit of Fantasia, but instead focusing more heavily on jazz, swing, and other popular contemporary forms of music for its time. As many of Disney's animators had been drafted into the army, the studio had various unfinished segments and ideas sitting around, making their way into this film. Make Mine Music would recycle a cut Fantasia segment that was originally set to Claire de Lune, but had a new song titled Blue Bayou written and set to the animation. The film would also feature jazz pieces such as All the Cats Join In or After You've Gone, with the music having been written and performed by Benny Goodman and his orchestra. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to focus on one particular segment, titled Casey at the Bat. Based on a famous American poem published in 1888, the story depicts a baseball game in the town of Mudville in 1902. The crowd arrives for the game, anticipating the performance of Casey, known to be the star player of the team and feared by others for his ability. However, through his arrogance and tendency to showboat, Casey accidentally throws the game, being knocked out by the ball on the third strike. It's a short little story, but one that has loosely made its way into the parks. In 1992, Casey's Corner would premiere at the end of Disneyland Paris' Main Street, and the Refreshment Corner in Magic Kingdom would close and reopen in 1995 with the same theme as well. While I'm not familiar with the Paris version, as far as I can determine, they're both essentially the same. Inside, this small quick-service restaurant is themed around baseball, and its menu consists mostly of hot dogs. The decor inside features photos of baseball players and teams, as well as equipment related to the sport. Other than the actual menu, which features players in a similar animation style to the segment, the actual cartoon seems to have very little influence in the design, instead focusing more on American baseball culture, which I can appreciate. In the back half, there is interior seating, but it used to be a room that had bleachers where guests could sit and watch the segment, as well as a 1954 sequel short known as Casey Bats Again. In 2014, this was removed in favor of now expanded seating, as crowd levels and park demand for this location greatly exceeded its seating capacity. While removing this element essentially turns Casey's Corner into an adaptation in name only, the loose theme is still somewhat connected. Following Make Mine Music, Fun and Fancy Free would debut in 1947, packaging two short films together. The first is Bongo, focusing on the story of a circus bear who breaks free from his train to go and explore the wild. There, he discovers that he's not cut out for the woods, and falls in love with a bear named Lullabelle. After a fight with a larger, meaner bear named Lumpjaw, Bongo outwits him and ends up happily with Lullabelle. The second film in this feature is Mickey and the Beanstalk, featuring of course Mickey along with Donald and Goofy as poor peasants. The valley is kept alive through a singing harp, but as she is stolen, a drought spreads throughout the land. As an adaptation of Jack and the Beanstalk, a starving Mickey sells his cow for beans, only for Donald to throw them out in anger. The next morning, Mickey and his friends find a giant beanstalk has sprouted and they've risen with it into the clouds. They then find themselves in a strange land and eventually make their way into the castle of Willie the Giant. From here, they find themselves in conflict with him as they try to rescue the harp, eventually climbing back down and chopping the beanstalk where he falls to his demise. To my knowledge, the story of Bongo isn't found anywhere in the parks, but Mickey and the Beanstalk certainly is. Yet again, in both Magic Kingdom and Disneyland Paris, there's a shop called Sir Mickey's, selling generic Fantasyland merchandise. I am again less familiar with the Paris version, but it appears that the Magic Kingdom location has just a bit more theming related to the film. In one corner, you can see Mickey standing on the beanstalk that permeates throughout the store. If you follow it, you'll eventually see Willie lifting the ceiling and peeking inside. While some of the store is just a generic medieval theme, you will also find window displays that refer specifically to Willie. For whatever reason, one of the windows features Huey, Dewey, and Louie preparing to battle the giant, even though they never made an appearance in the film. Continuing onward, Disney's next film, Melody Time, would release in 1948. As with Make Mine Music, Melody Time is another spiritual successor to Fantasia, also focusing more heavily on contemporary pieces and jazz through 7 different segments. Notable for this video is the story of Pecos Bill, which starts with an animated segment moving through the Texas desert, synced with the song Blue Shadows on the Trail. This eventually transitions to a live-action segment of cowboys singing the song around a campfire. Once the song concludes, one of the children asks why coyotes howl at night, and one of the cowboys replies that it's because of Pecos Bill. He then relates his story as the film switches back to animation, describing how the Texas hero was raised by coyotes, saved his famous horse Widowmaker from vultures, and eventually tamed the land through his extraordinary abilities, such as lassoing a cyclone. As the hero of Texas, taming the land and chasing down outlaws, Bill eventually encounters Slewfoot Sue, with whom he falls in love with. Competing for his attention, Widowmaker becomes jealous of Sue. The two plan to get married, and Sue wants to ride Widowmaker at the ceremony, only making the horse angrier. Sue eventually gets on Widowmaker, who manages to buck her off and into the sky. Having no concern because of his abilities, Bill attempts to lasso her down, only to be surprised when he misses. Having been sabotaged by Widowmaker stepping on the rope, Sue makes it up to the moon, where she is trapped forever. Mournfully, Bill would spend every night forward howling at the moon, with the coyotes joining in. This story, to my knowledge, is only represented in Pecos Bill, Tall Tale Inn and Cafe at both Magic Kingdom and Tokyo Disneyland. As one of the more popular quick service locations in Magic Kingdom, it opened with the park, but did see an expansion in 1998. On the sign at the main entrance, you can see Pecos Bill himself, and going further inside, you can find portraits of Widowmaker and Slewfoot Sue if you look in the right areas. Throughout the location, there are also objects on display given to Bill from various Western heroes of different stories and lore. Finally, while not connected to Bill in any particular way, I do really like this one seating area designed to look like a small Mexican town at night. The last few films I've covered have been rather obscure to most people, even to the most dedicated of Disney fans. However, let's now explore the final film of the war era that is probably its most iconic, with certainly the strongest representation of the parks. In 1949, the last package film developed during the war would premiere as The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad. Like fun and fancy-free, this film would consist of two stories, first introducing Mr. Toad in an adaptation of The Wind in the Willows. With a particular weakness for contemporary fads, Mr. Toad has been brought close to bankruptcy and is in danger of losing his house, Toad Manor. One day, Toad's bookkeeper, Angus McBadger, asks his friends to convince Toad to cease frantically driving a horse and carriage around the countryside, damaging property and incurring serious liability costs. Toad's friends attempt to keep him in the house, but he escapes and purchases his new obsession, a motor car. He is then arrested and accused of stealing the car, arguing instead that he purchased it from a gang of weasels who were discovered to have stolen the car themselves. Through a series of antics, Toad's name is cleared and the weasels eventually arrested, only for the story to conclude with Toad finding a new obsession, the Wright Flyer. Of the war stories, this one has the oldest representation in the parks, with Mr. Toad's Wild Ride having opened with Disneyland in 1955. The ride would change throughout the years, but puts riders into the role of Mr. Toad, terrorizing the English countryside in a runaway motor car. The Magic Kingdom would open with a version of this attraction in 1971, and though the premise was the same, the layout and scenes were quite different. This would then sadly be replaced with the underwhelming Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh in 1999. Still, it's good to see a quality attraction representing the war-era films still around, and is easily one of my favorites when visiting Disneyland. The second story featured in the film is The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, relating how Ichabod Crane arrives to the town to be the new schoolmaster. As a superstitious but mischievous man, he attempts to court Katrina Van Tassel and marry her for her money. Interested in another man named Brom Bones, Katrina attempts to make him jealous by then befriending Ichabod. At a Halloween party, Brom attempts to scare Ichabod with the story of the Headless Horseman. On his way home, Ichabod is then targeted by the spirit, and in the morning, only his hat and a smashed pumpkin are found, fueling the validity of the story. Probably the most famous of the war-era stories because it's often shown around Halloween by teachers in US elementary schools, the only representation found in the parks is the Headless Horseman leading the Halloween party parades in both the Magic Kingdom and Disneyland. While the representation is minimal, he is a really cool character to see, and while it would have been cool to have a Fantasyland dark ride with this story, the parade character is still pretty great. The Disney Silver Age would begin in 1950 with Cinderella, resulting in a new era of iconic Disney films such as Alice in Wonderland, Peter Pan, and The Jungle Book, among many others. Still, if you're interested in the history of Disney animation, the war-era films are not to be overlooked. While not nearly as iconic as other films in the Disney canon, they do have a surprising level of representation in the parks, but are often overlooked because people are just simply less aware of their existence. You couldn't be blamed for missing the film connection in Casey's Corner, or knowing that Pecos Bill is based on an animated segment in a long-forgotten film. It's kinda surprising that the parks even have locations themed to such obscure animation, but hopefully it gives you a deeper appreciation for the parks. If you enjoy content like this, I once again would like to ask my audience to just leave a like, as it really helps the video gain more exposure. As always, you can also subscribe and hit the bell icon so as to be notified when new videos are released.